regăsit la interviurile Festivalului de Muzică Veche București, ediția 2016. Eu sunt Radu Mihalache și de această dată am alături de mine doi flautiști de o importanță extraordinară pentru repertoriile muzicii vechi, constructori de instrumente, profesori, dar în primul și în primul rând soliști concertiști, Jan de Winne și Michael Lynn. It's a pleasure to have you both here.
Thank you.
How is it? Is it your first time in Bucharest, or have you been here before?
For me, it's my first time.
And for me, I don't know, fifth or sixth time, yes.
You've been
before.
Then play.
Yes.
What are your expectations about this concert, about the audience, or?
Well, I hope they will enjoy the flutes, whatever flute it is, as we brought a bunch of different flutes. And, but yeah, my vision is whatever the instrument, it's the emotion you get through is more important than just the instrument. But that being said, our choice in life was to look for each piece, each period, to have the right tool, the right instruments that comes the most close to the language of that music.
And I think it's a fun concert for people to listen to because it's not all one type of piece. Where many different styles and different instrumentation and many different flutes. And so there's quite a bit of variety to it. It's not the kind of concert where you have to hear the same thing for an hour and a half. It's quite interesting.
So we'll have a diverse palette of sounds and of music.
Definitely.
I'd like to go with both of you to your musical beginnings. And if you remember, if you know, what was the first moment when you came into contact with music and said, oh, that's what I want to do. That's my life. Michael?
Well, for me, both my parents are musicians. My father was a musicologist and a keyboard player and a specialist in Bach. And my mother was a flute player. And when I was quite young, I played recorder very young, but I actually tried to get good on the recorder. It wasn't just like playing it at school. I actually tried to play real music. And then my mother taught me modern flute. And then when I was about 10, I guess, I joined a professional boy choir. And so I, for 5 years, was at a school, a boarding school that was a professional boy choir. And part of that experience was that I came to love the early music repertoire because we sang quite a bit of Renaissance and Baroque music. And it just seemed to me like the kind of music that I wanted to do. And as I got older, it stayed just the same, and I kind of progressed from there.
So it clicked and
very,
it
very
remained.
early, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Well, I grew up in Bruges, really in the center, and when I was quite young, my older brother used to take me to the concerts. And Bruges is famous for the early music scene, was one of the first festivals. So in an early stage, it was like part of the musical life next to other things. And then I also was lucky when I studied modern flute as a teenager that my modern flute teacher had an open mind and was also interested in Baroque flute. And well, personally, I loved harpsichord and on an early stage to listen to early music. And through the festival, I met some people who gave me a Baroque flute to start with when I was 16. So that was really lucky, and then that's how it started, the passion.
And this evolved for both of you in great careers, collaborations with many ensembles and orchestras, with conductors and all sorts of musicians. Each of you, which one was, let's say, your greatest passion, your greatest pleasure playing with that ensemble? Jan?
There's not just one, but there are, of course, important personalities that have marked me. I played for many years with Philipp Herwig, and I learned really from him the love for a nice sound, and especially for the right phrasing. He's always obsessed with when there are singers to put the words exactly in the right place and with the right emotion. And so I did a lot of Bach cantatas, but when I play now instrumental music, I see like the same structures without the words. I learned a lot from that. And then another very strong experience was that once I was invited to play with Concentus Musicus with Harnoncourt, the St. Matthew's Passion. And I had the impression that he was in 1960, I think, the first recording, and the material we used was from that recording with all annotations. But it's not that we were making music with the pencil, but the way he was conducting and what he was asking, it was so strong and so coherent that was a real lesson of that was really a very strong experience musically, yes.
Michael?
Yeah, and my situation is a little different because in North America, we don't have the same level of famous early music conductors that we have in Europe. I would love to have had that experience. For me, though, I was very lucky, and I got a position right when I graduated from college, so I was 20 or 21 with a real Baroque orchestra, and got to play many concerts for a long time. And then as time went on, that group went away, and I played with a pretty well-known group called Apollo's Fire for about 10 years, and also with Tafelmusik in Canada, which is a very fine group. So I spent a lot of time doing sort of orchestral things, and I found that to be very exciting. Always, for me, learning new music and experiencing new things. I think some people think, well, if it's old music, then there's nothing new about it, but that's not right, because there is so much music, and there's so much music that nobody has ever played in the 21st century. So it's really an extraordinary adventure. And then when you add into that all of the different types of flutes, it's very multidimensional and very
music
fun.
is alive.
Yeah,
And,
indeed. Yeah.
You said one interesting thing, and a thing that we don't really know here in Europe. How is the early music scene in North America?
Well, I think it's quite good. It's not the same as it is in Europe. It doesn't have the same density. You know, like there might be a Baroque orchestra in one town, and then there's another Baroque orchestra 750 miles away. Whereas in Europe, you know, if you're in Holland, there's an orchestra here, and then you walk down the street and there's another orchestra. So it's very different in that way. I think we have some very fine schools that teach early music. I teach at Oberlin Conservatory of Music, which is an extremely fine school, but there are not very many schools that someone can go and seriously study the Baroque flute, for instance. So again, compared to Europe, people have a different experience. And one of the other problems is that people generally don't get exposed to serious early music playing until they get to college. Whereas I think, as with Jan's experience, often people in Europe are hearing it while they're growing up, or they're hearing it while they're in high school, or maybe they've been in a good choir. There are many more possibilities, I think, here. But it is strong there. We have very good audiences. And a lot of groups do quite a bit of touring and recording, so it's a good thing there.
You talked about the audience. I've noticed, that's my opinion, that the early music audience is different from the classical music audience. What do you think about this? Is it true?
In what way are they different?
They know better their stuff. They are passionate about it. They are a specific group I think.
Yes, I see. Yes, that's positive. Also, it can have a danger, like in Belgium and Holland, where there is a lot going on since a long time. The danger is that the people don't come to listen to the music, but how you play it. And then a little bit of the real function of a concert is lost, because it's not anymore a transmission of a message of the composer, but more, an event where you compare. It's like more like sport then. But well, I won't be that negative, but that's the dark side of it. But of course, it's true that people know about it, but I have also the experience of going to the East or to South America where they're not used to it. They love the early music that we make, the instruments, and they have a much more open mind receiving the music. But yeah, that's I always have a very good feeling when I go far away where people are not used to it. And it's also a good test to see that it really works, that it's not because that we're not doing a museum art, something for specialists. Look, we are going to do it like it was, and because that's our responsibility, our choice. But the public should not hear a difference in quality, I find, in quality of expression and also of intonation. Yeah.
Yes. So you're looking, first of all, for the impact that you have, an impact on the audience, not, let's say, I don't know, more technical stuff, but the raw impact on the audience.
Well, you could say that you can make music as if you were in a crystal ball, and it's fantastic, and the public can assist to that. But for me, reading a lot about 17th and 18th century music, you come about a lot of text about musical rhetoric and the musician compared to a narrator who has to deliver the composition. So that's why I'm obsessed indeed with the impact. Mm-hmm.
I think that that hopefully our main goal is to communicate the music to an audience in a way that we feel is expressing our own ideas, but that they will understand. That's if we do things and they don't understand it, then that's not working. And so, we're trying to play in a way that reaches people. And I think regarding the audiences, in fact, that even though most of the people who come to the early music concerts are people who know that they like early music, when we go and play for people who are regular audiences, be it in South America or in some little town in the United States, people always like it. They don't know that they're going to like it, but when they hear it, they like it, and they think, well, that's a lot nicer than hearing a Beethoven symphony. They have a different reaction to it. So I think the music, if it's played well and it's played by people who are trying to tell the audience something with their playing, that people enjoy it. And people obviously enjoy things on different levels. Some people know a lot, and so there's more of an intellectual thing going on, and other people in the audience, it's just, wow, that's just beautiful. It's just
the joy of discovery.
Yeah.
Well, here at the Bucharest Early Music Festival, you'll be telling the story of the traverso flute.
Yes.
What is this great story? When does it start, and how did it evolve?
Well, when does it start? That's mythology, but the principle, it can start very early, as you need just a pipe with holes and an embouchure, but in Romania you have flutes where you blow on this end. Yes. Here there is a cork in it, so the flute the tube is closed at one end. And then, typical for the traverso is that the mouth hole is here, and you make the sound like that by blowing on the edge. So for me, the history doesn't start with this, but in my life as a flute maker and player, it starts with this, because we have some originals. That's a Renaissance flute. Normally, most of them are in one part. This one is in two parts. And what is typical, so you don't see a key. but it's a cylindrical bore, just as the modern flute. So this is like the ancestor, which is also, well, the head is not really cylindrical, but the body is. And the big change comes at the end of the 17th century in France. Traditionally, we say the Haute family, but that's not proved. But okay, let's say to be simple, the French type flute is in 3 parts. And the big difference is that the head joint stayed quite cylindrical, but then the whole body gets conical, and the foot joint in this case is rather again cylindrical, but later flutes it will open up. And there is a key, of course, very important. So why is it cylindrical, goes it conical? To improve the octaves, to have maybe an easier way to play the octaves. And of course, with the key, we add a half tone, because if I want a half tone, I have to play with a half whole on a Renaissance flute, and it's very soft, so this helps. But the whole character of the sound changes a lot. This is a rather clear sound, and this will go warmer and darker. And another thing very important, because just comparing flutes, how they look, it's nice, but there is also something with the pitch. This is 1 tone lower, which means that it makes, you have a bigger air column, so the sound is warmer, and it takes another energy to put it in vibration.
So
that's the first Baroque stage.
Yeah, and another way to think about the difference is that these flutes were thought of as consort instruments. So you would often be playing flutes together with other flutes, and these flutes were thought of as solo instruments. So they, this was the main leap from the consort idea. There were some flutes that are sort of halfway in between, but in general, it went pretty quickly from the cylindrical flute that was a consort instrument, was not loud. It wasn't meant to play big solos on, although you might play a big solo along with 4 other flutes. But then these flutes were meant to be played one at a time, or maybe in pairs was very common, and it became part of orchestral repertoire very quickly.
Well, as we move along the eras, what would be the next stage looking at them?
The next stage is that they divide that middle joint in 2, and then you get a 4-part flute. And the advantage of this is you can exchange this middle joint, because there was no fixed pitch. So you had another pitch from, if you were in this castle and you have to go to play in church, it's another pitch. So they would exchange this part for longer or a shorter joint. So many of the old flutes come with 7 joints, which were then 1 comma apart, so that you would have a tone difference from the longest to the shortest joint. That's not always working perfectly, but the idea was to be flexible, to adapt to other pitches. Probably another reason is if you have this 1 part here, if it's in certain woods, it would go oval or, well, go bad, and then you have to replace the whole, would bend, yes. Yeah. And in this way, if there's a problem, you don't have to replace the whole
Also, you
piece.
just take
or also, yes, you take it apart, and you can work or exchange 1 part of the flute. Also, if you want to do a correction in the bore, if it's bent, it's harder to get to the right spot.
But it isn't like in the modern flute, and if you wanted to go higher or lower just by...
Yeah, you can, but if you do this, there is a big difference in diameter. So you make like an air chamber here, which is much more important than when you do that with metal. The difference is 0.5 millimeter, or even
it's very, very small.
It's very small, so you don't have a problem of distortion in the bore and in the air column. Here it affects the intonation. I can do this, but it happened once to me that it was so warm, had to pull out that, and then your whole flute is out of tune.
Oh.
Yeah,
wow.
It can be pulled out a little bit, but generally I think in the Baroque period, they were made to be in tune, pushed all the way in. Wouldn't you say that was the goal? And,
Yes.
And then if you happened to be a little sharp, you could pull out.
Moving from the Baroque to the classical period, what improvements did the instruments have?
Well, improvement is not the right word. It's a change of style. And there is one missing link. The principle is the same. And actually, yeah, it's easy to show. We still have like a Baroque flute, but just in the middle between those holes, there is another hole for, in that case, for F natural, G sharp, B flat. So they add the missing notes on the acoustical spot. And of course, as you don't have other fingers for the holes, it works with keys. So that was invented actually in England quite early, 1755, 1760. There are early examples, much earlier than was taught before. In the first stage, it was for slow movements and to have, yeah, a pure tone, a pure
You
tone.
get a bigger sound when you play a G sharp with a key as opposed to a G sharp without a key. And so they were starting to prefer a sound that was very even, whereas on the Baroque flute, one of the things that's very beautiful about it is that the character of each note is a little different from every other note. And you know, we as flute players try to find, in effect, find the beautiful part of every note. And that's part of how we make it expressive. And in the Romantic, this flute is from it's a little over 200 years old. So it's an early Romantic flute. And by that time, many people were trying to get the flute so it sounded very even and more homogenized.
So this is a flute that we could encounter in Schubert's period or Mendelssohn.
Well, this is a French example, and this is around 1810. So a Schubert player would play on a Viennese flute, probably. So that's another thing about these early flutes, is that in different countries they produced completely different kinds of flutes. That's why we have to have so many flutes if we're serious about this, because when we play French music, we want to play a French flute. If you're playing English music, ideally you would play English. German and Viennese tend to go together, and they're actually very, very different from one another. Like the French, their most important thing was that the sound needed to be very sweet, and it needed to play very easily up high. And the Viennese, at least in my opinion, see if you agree, but they're aiming for a fuller sound. It's a broader sound, which sounds really very good in an orchestra. But it's actually much harder to play up high than it is on these French flutes. And the English were into making flutes as loud as possible. And they made the tone holes very large, and they used more keys than other people. And so each country had its own special way.
If we'd have a complete collection, we'd fill up the room.
Yeah,
sure.
Yeah.
So how did we come from these one, which we can see they are wooden, they are, to the metal one? That's why many people don't understand why the flute is a woodwind, because they see it and it's all metal. How did we come to this?
Well, one of the ways we refer to this flute is the Böhm flute, because it was invented by Theobald Böhm. And his flute, when it started, was not a cylindrical flute, and it was not in metal. It was a conical flute, just like these, except with a key system that was like the modern flute, the Böhm system keys. And then in 1847, he went back to the drawing board and developed a cylindrical bodied flute. And the big deal there was that a cylindrical body could be made out of metal, whereas conical body out of metal was very difficult. They did experiment with it, but it was not a big success. So starting in 1847, the metal cylindrical flute comes out. And interestingly, people didn't immediately decide that that was the best flute, and they kept using the other type of Böhm flute as well as these kinds of flutes. And it wasn't really until the 20th century that everybody just said, okay, this is the flute, we're going to go with this now. That it took a long, long time, and at first people did not like these flutes. Many flute players didn't like them. They were very different from the old flutes. And
you would even think like Wagner, who liked the big orchestra, would love the invention, but he hated the Böhm flute. He called it Gewaltrohren or violent tubes, canon.
Yeah.
And well, one of the reasons is that with the old system and the conical, if you play the high notes, they're I don't know how each note is the harmonic of something, and it mixes very beautiful in the chords. As this is again more soloist conception, so here the flute player has to work a lot with the lips and with his technique to get it also very, very beautiful. Of course, I'm not saying, for me, there's not one better than the other, but it's a completely different concept, and also acoustically, it's another world.
I imagine for you it's very important. You also are a builder. How did this passion come to be? How did you start doing this?
Most passions start when you are a child. So I saw violin makers and I thought, that looks, working with wood has always fascinated me. But then I was fascinated how this is put together, so I would put it apart and love to repair the modern flutes. But then, well, again, by growing up in the right place, I met Marcel Poncele, the oboe player, who on a very early stage made his own oboe. So I went visiting his workshop, and that opened something. I'd like to do that too. But my father said, no, you have to go to a technical school if you want to do that. And I thought, no, I don't want to go to a technical school. I want to study musicology. So I waited still after my studies, and then I started. And Marcel was so kind to teach me how to do it. And then I developed further on my own. Yeah.
I think it's interesting. Is it a different connection when you also know how to make it? If, you made that instrument as a player. Is it different?
Well, I guess as a player of every instrument, if you want to be a good player, you have to imagine the sound before you play. You don't just touch the instrument and that comes out. No, you have an idea of the sound and you make it, you produce it. When you make the flute, it's exactly the same. You have to have an idea of which sound has to come out of the instrument. So for me, it's like working on the same sound, but from two sides. Another thing is I have the impression when I play a concert, I'm concentrating the energy here and I diffuse it in the whole. When I work days on an instrument, it's as if I'm taking the energy and I put it in one point in this instrument. So it's a perfect balance for me.
That's nice.
But with the years of experience, I see that this sound that I have in my head, it also shows up in the flutes. And so for me, yes, in a kind, it's perfect. I can make the perfect tool for me. On the other hand, I'm never pleased with the instrument and always in doubt. So if I buy or play on an instrument that somebody else made, then it's finished and I don't touch it anymore. If it's my own instrument, after a few days, maybe I could improve this. And the next day you say, I shouldn't have touched it. So it's not always, an instrument gets better, 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 and then suddenly it gets worse. And there is, you can always cut wood away, but you cannot put it back. Yeah, you can start with glue, but it's.
So you suffer that, they say that if a writer opens up a book of his, the first thing he'll see a typo or a mistake in the book. Is the same
it must be the same. It must be the same, indeed.
Yes. What I would like to ask you both, learning a historical instrument, it's a bit different than learning a modern one. What are the principal reading resources that you both have used in your life?
To get the style, you mean?
Yes.
Well, and even also the technique. Oh yeah, as a flute player, our Bible is Quantz. There's a flute treatise from 1752, reflecting not only on how you play the flute, but I think 3/4 or 2/3 of the book is also about other instruments, and even how do you become a musician, or how, as a child, what should you care for? And then every instrument of the orchestra have a chapter. What is needed to be a good first violin? What is needed to be a good viola player, and etc. And it's very funny to read it, and even you could put it on the desk of every orchestra player. It sounds as if it was written today. It's not old.
He even talks, one of my favorite parts is he talks about music critics. And when you get a bad review for your concert, you know, should that bother you? And he's like, you know much more about how you should be playing than the critic does, so you should not pay any attention to it at all. And I was just so fascinated when I saw that in there. So, and there's also the famous treatise by Otter, which tells us something about the flute playing at the beginning of the 18th century. And that's very different from Quantz, not nearly as detailed, but it still gives us lots of things. Yeah. And then when we get into the 19th century, there are zillions of other treatises of various types of interest.
Yes. Well, this is a method of learning, but you, Michael, you are a teacher also.
Oh, we're both.
Yes, yeah. I know of you. You are at Oberlin.
Yeah.
That's where you have your students. How are these new generations of musicians?
I think that in many ways, not in all ways, but in many ways, the musicians just keep getting better and better. I think, especially if you look at the kind of the standard instruments, like the modern flute players that come to Oberlin. I mean, some of them, you know, they're 18 years old, and they can play anything. They can play anything. And maybe they don't play everything perfectly or musically in the best way, but the skills that they start out with are very, very strong. When you approach Baroque flute, it's a little different, though, because most of them have never played the Baroque flute. So they've played the modern flute, and they're very good at it, and they pick up the Baroque flute, and they're very bad at it. And so, you know, it takes a while to figure out how to get things to synchronize so that the things that are good about being a flute player help them, but the things that are different about the modern flute don't make it harder for them on the Baroque flute. They start by saying, well, this should be just like this except without the keys. And so they try to play it the same way, and of course that doesn't work at all. So it takes a lot of sensitivity. The good aspect of that is, I think Jan and I both agree on this, that students who study the Baroque flute, who are fine modern flute players, get better on the modern flute because they become more sensitive, they're more critical about intonation, they think more about articulation, many aspects of playing that they don't normally in modern flute playing pay a lot of attention to.
So. Is it difficult to attract flutists to Baroque flute and to Baroque music?
No, not anymore. On the contrary, as there are many modern flute players, many try also to taste the early flute and see it as an extra knowledge that can help them for their future career. And also there are so many recordings on the market. When we started and when Michael started, we had to discover a lot by ourselves.
Yeah.
And now they can get a feel of the style very easily. So it's even sometimes difficult to say try to make your opinion for yourself and read some books so that you know that why you do those things, because they just pick up by listening to recordings, which again makes the whole level higher and faster because they can skip some stages. So no complaints. It's just an ongoing evolution.
But it also might be dangerous skipping those steps sometimes, don't you think?
Yes, but I don't want to sound like the old guy. In my time, it was better. It's their responsibility. That's what I try to say. That in the end, also when I was young, I didn't understand when somebody said you have to have a vision in your playing. You just play music because it's beautiful and you want to have fun. And then with the experience, you discover that if you have an idea that's music is just more than a beautiful sound, but that it carries emotions and a message, and that you have to be able to make a speech which has an internal logic, and then of course not also an internal logic for you or for your aunt, but that it's connected to what the composer might have intended. That's our first idea with this early music practice, to connect with the composer's intention.
At least something they would have recognized, because if Bach heard many modern flute players playing a Bach flute sonata with piano accompaniment, he would be, well, what's this? So we sometimes talk about it in terms of language, that we try to teach people the language of being expressive on the Baroque flute. And in many ways, that's the most critical thing. Once they learn that language and they learn how to express things well on the instrument, then the rest is not so hard.
Well, Michael, Jan, thank you very much. It was a great pleasure having you here and having you at the Early Music Festival here in Bucharest. Vă mulțumesc și eu, sunt Radu Mihalache și vă aștept din nou la întâlnirile noastre în cadrul Festivalului de Muzică Veche București.
Radio Clasic, un radio în culori.